Wir sagen herzlich willkommen. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Germany. Iniho Musica. Okay.
Good enough. Good enough.
And again, say it again.
Good enough.
Okay, good enough. Okay, I found my best. Now, Fabian, come on stage, and this is for you.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry.
There is only one thing I understood: Spanian. No. Basque. First of all, I'd like to thank the German Triathlon Union for the invitation, and in particular Dennis. He's been very insisting to bring me here, and I'm always happy to have the opportunity to discuss with coaches in different sports. And I need to apologize for not being able to do this presentation in German. I could have done it in Basque, in Spanish, in French, but I'm going to have to do it in English. I don't speak German, unfortunately. We are going to be talking about training load quantification and monitoring of athletes' adaptation. And these are the topics that I'm going to try to cover during the presentation. First of all, some basics of quantification. Then I will talk about what we can learn from relating external load and performance. Then what we can learn from relating external load with internal load with performance. Then we will move on to the topic of monitoring training load to understand fatigue and, of course, to avoid maladaptation to the training process. And we will finish with some concluding remarks. So the first topic of basics of quantification, there is one point that is so simple that it sounds stupid, but quite often we don't keep it in mind. And that point is that we need to quantify what the athletes do, not what the coach plans them to do. Because in reality, there are three different training loads. The training load that the coach plans at the beginning of the season, the training that the coach prescribes on the day, and then there is the third training load, which is the training that the athlete actually performs on the day. Because maybe you quantify this, but one athlete is not there because they have an exam the next day. Or another athlete might be doing one part of the training, but not another part because they have a knee pain. So what we need to quantify is this training load down here, the one that the athlete actually performs on the day. Look at the date of this reference. It's 1991. This is a paper by Will Hopkins, a physiologist from New Zealand, and I think this is a key reference in everything that has to do with the quantification of the training load. In this paper, of course, he didn't take into consideration the electronic and the innovative means of quantification that we have nowadays. But back then, he said that basically the methods of quantification included the retrospective questionnaires, diaries, physiological monitoring, and direct observation. One of the problems with questionnaires and diaries is that they don't take into consideration the subjectivity of the athlete. So if we want to avoid that problem of subjectivity, we have to go to purely objective methods, and therefore we need to rely on physiological monitoring or even on direct observation. When a coach is on pool deck taking times, or on the track taking times, or watching the athlete, they are doing direct observation. The problem is that sometimes we might introduce the subjectivity of the coach. We will avoid the subjectivity of the athlete, but we might introduce the subjectivity of the coach. But as important as knowing the methods of quantification is knowing and understanding the applications of the training data. What can we do with the training data? Well, according to Will Hopkins, we can motivate the athletes and systematize the entire training process. We can use this method for training prescription, and of course we can do sports science. And we are going to see a lot of real-life examples of using training data to produce high-quality sports science. This is an editorial that I wrote in 2013 called "The Alphabet of Sports Science Research Starts with Q." It doesn't start with A, it doesn't start with B, it starts with Q for quantification. Why? Because I still consider the quantification of training a cornerstone of athletic preparation for competition and a key issue when it comes to good sports science research. It is not possible to identify the effects of training without a precise quantification of the workload. And without precise, thorough, and in-depth information about training, the findings of a training study are of very little or no value. If you tell me, oh, I observed that the hemoglobin value of this athlete changed between April and June, but you don't tell me what that athlete did between April and June, I'm not learning anything. That information is absolutely useless from a practical point of view. So we need to be able to quantify the training load if we want to understand the relationship between that training load and the biological outcomes and, of course, the performance outcomes. And the first point we need to understand very clearly is that external load and internal load are not the same thing. The external load is an objective measure of the work that an athlete completes during training or competition and is measured independently of the internal workload. When we talk training hours, external. When we talk training kilometers, external. When we talk power output, external. When we talk kilograms, external load. The internal load is the biological stress imposed by the training session and is defined by the disturbance in homeostasis of the physiological and metabolic processes during the exercise training session. When we talk blood lactate, internal. When we talk oxygen uptake, internal. When we talk heart rate, internal. And we need to understand that the external training load does not measure the biological stress imposed by the training session. That doesn't mean that it is useless. And we are going to see that it is not useless, but we need to have it very clear in our heads that it's not the same thing. Of course, when we try to quantify the training load, we need to keep in consideration the different components of training. Main components are frequency, volume, and intensity. Frequency and volume are fairly easy to quantify. The problem usually comes when we need to quantify intensity. And that's when we need to rely on physiological monitoring. What you see here is the training volume, in this situation in hours, of Ainhoa Murua, a female triathlete that I coached to 4 Olympic Games, between 2004 and 2012. We are missing Rio over here. And we can, of course, analyze the evolution of the total training hours, the evolution of the cycling hours, the swimming hours, and the running hours. And one interesting thing that we can learn from this is an analysis that I did retrospectively, is that the classic differentiation of quadriennial plans between monocyclic plans and bicyclic plans does not always apply. If you look at the cycle that goes from Athens to Beijing, this doesn't look at all like a monocycle training plan or a bicycle training plan. In fact, her training volume actually drops after Athens for a couple of years. On the other hand, if you look at the quadriennium between Beijing and London, that's exactly a bicyclical quadriennium, in which there is a growth in training volume from year 1 to year 2, a small drop in year 3, and then a bump in year 4. That is the exact definition of a bicyclical approach based on Bompa's definition of a quadriennium. So the reality does not always fit the models that are available in the training literature. Of course, we can go further and we can assess the training volume week by week. And here we see the swimming kilometers, we see the cycling hours, and we see the running hours over a 50-week triathlon season. This is the season in the lead up to the London Olympics in 2012. We can go further and we can quantify each session. And in this sense, we see that there were 303 swim sessions, 194 cycling sessions, 254 running sessions, 45 strength training sessions, for a total of 796 sessions in these 50 weeks of training. That is an average of 16 16 sessions of training per week. We can also quantify the volume precisely, how many kilometers of swimming, how many hours of cycling, how many hours of running in total and per week. And of course, we can assess the days of rest, and we can also assess how many weeks that athlete passed training at home or away in a training camp situation. That is also important, because an athlete that is away is an additional stress in their daily life. When we come to physiological monitoring, basically we need to rely on oxygen uptake, heart rate, and blood lactate. Most often, as coaches or as physiologists, in my case, we don't want the athlete to perform at a given heart rate. We want the athlete to perform at a given percentage of maximal oxygen uptake or at a given blood lactate concentration. But because we cannot measure that all the time, we tend to rely on something that has a lot of practical value, which is heart rate. So our goal is a given oxygen uptake or a given blood lactate concentration, but we prescribe the training with a given value of heart rate. And because of that, we need to understand also what is the relationship between blood lactate and heart rate over time. This is a study that was done with speed skaters, and then it has been reproduced with runners, with cross-country skiers, and with cyclists, trying to assess whether the relationship between blood lactate and heart rate is stable over time. So they took the athletes to the lab in June, and then 3 months later in September. And they looked at 3 markers of training intensity: aerobic threshold, anaerobic threshold, and maximal power. And as you can see, there has been a shift to the right in the blood lactate curve, as you would expect as a consequence of effective training. So the question is, the heart rate value that we recommended in June corresponding to the aerobic threshold, is it still the same in September? The heart rate value that we recommended in June for the anaerobic threshold, is it still the same in September? And the answer with highly trained athletes is yes. This relationship is very stable over time. So those values that you prescribed at the beginning of the season should still be valid 3 months later or 6 months later. And we also need to assess the relationship between heart rate and VO2, because sometimes we want a given VO2, but we prescribe a given heart rate. And we need to know that even if we work with a percentage of heart rate reserve, which is the difference between the maximal heart rate and the resting heart rate, and a percentage of VO2 max, the relationship is not perfect, particularly at low intensities. As you can see, at 40% of heart rate reserve, we don't get 40% of VO2 max. If we want a perfect relationship, we need to assess VO2 reserve. And that means that we need to assess resting oxygen uptake and maximal oxygen uptake, if we want a given percentage of heart rate to represent a given percentage of VO2 max. And those are things that we should keep in mind when we quantify the training and also when we prescribe the training. Using this type of approach, in my case, blood lactate concentrations, we can, of course, assess the training intensity distribution over an entire season. This is Ainhoa Murua's 50-week average training intensity distribution. 82% was performed below her individual lactate threshold. 11.2 between the ILT and the 4 millimole intensity. And only 6.2 was performed above the OBLA intensity, the 4 millimole intensity. We can go further and look at the training intensity distribution in swimming, the training intensity distribution in cycling, the training intensity distribution in running. And that way we are quantifying all the different components of her training. But this is for the entire season. And we don't learn a lot from the entire season, because does this mean that she has to train like that every mesocycle? Does it mean that she has to train like that every microcycle, every single session? Should you maintain that intensity distribution in every single session? So you can go and analyze week by week the training intensity distribution. If you look at week number 1, 100% is below the individual lactate threshold, so zone 1. If you look at week 37, about 65% is zone 1, about 20% is zone 3, and the rest is zone 2. So there is a huge variation in training intensity distribution throughout the year. And of course, there is a lot of variation in training intensity distribution day by day. Sorry, this is in Basque. So this is the 12th microcycle for Ainhoa. And as you can see, the variation in the, well, as you can imagine, the variation in training intensity is huge from day to day. Even if the overall volume is very, very high, 39 kilometers of swimming, 9 hours of cycling, 8.5 hours of running, and 2 sessions of strength training. And you can compare that with the Olympic Games microcycle. So here is the London. She didn't win, but my recommendation was for her to win. And then she could celebrate. Only if she won, she could celebrate. But here we see that the volume is much lower, the frequency is much lower, and of course, the training intensity distribution is going to be completely different. Is it interesting to relate external load with performance? Well, it can be very interesting. What you see here is the basis of my PhD, of my first PhD. An individual quantification of 19 to 29 training variables day by day for 19 international level swimmers in France. What you see here are the values by week, but this was done by day. Every single day we quantified the first year 19 training variables, and then the subsequent years up to 29 training variables. And then we had the athletes perform in competition or in training simulations repeatedly, so that we could relate what had been done in training with the effect that those training variables had in competition performance. And that gave us enough data to produce 3 scientific papers. In one of them, at the time, that was my goal, was to get a PhD, so I needed scientific papers. For the coaches, the goal was to take the results from these studies and apply them to their swimmers. So we learned, for example, that there was a relationship between the mean intensity of the training season and the performance improvement. We learned that by reducing training volume more during the taper, they would improve more. We learned that we reduce our fatigue level during the taper more than we improve our fitness by doing mathematical modeling of training adaptations. And then we use training and performance data to individualize training profiles and give specific individual recommendations to the coaches. So it's not a waste of time. Here you can do a visual analysis of the relationship between the training load, this is Ainhoa's season in 2012, and what happens in competition. All of these things are competitions. White squares are national level competitions, gray squares are international level competitions, and the black square is the Olympic Games in London. And the little number inside shows her position in that competition. So as you can see, she performed fairly well, fairly steady, fairly stable for up to 34 weeks. So a visual analysis can also be a valuable tool. Of course, we applied tapering strategies in the most important events. This was the Sydney World Triathlon Series. This was the European Championships 5 days later. This was the Madrid WTS. This was the Olympic Games in London, and this was the grand final in Auckland. So a simple visual analysis can give you interesting information. In the second part of my PhD, we wanted to go beyond relating training with performance. We wanted to understand the physiological processes underpinning that relationship. So we looked at the relationships between external load, markers of internal load, and how those markers had an impact on performance. And there again, we produced 3 scientific papers, one looking at the hormonal responses during intensive training and tapering, another one looking at the immunological responses during intensive training and tapering, and another one looking at hematological responses during intensive training and tapering. And relating those hormonal, hematological, immunological changes with what we were seeing in competition. So the effects of that external load on internal markers and the effects of those internal markers on performance. Then we moved on to running, and we analyzed similar things in junior middle distance runners. And then we moved on to cycling. And simply by performing a laboratory test with professional cyclists in the lead up to the Giro, the Vuelta, and the Tour de France, and estimating individual relationships between heart rate and power output, we then started using heart rate in competition, and we could estimate power output. Pretty simple. But nobody had done it. Nobody had described the physiological demands and the power output demands of professional cycling. So we estimated those power outputs and related them with lactate threshold values, individual lactate threshold values, to tell the cyclists and their coaches, well, you need to spend 40% of the time below your individual lactate threshold. You need to spend 20% of the time at your lactate threshold. You need to spend so many minutes above the OBLA in time trials, in mass start stages, and also in mountain climbs. So we compared first category, second category with off-category mountain climbs in the Giro, the Tour, and the Vuelta. So those are applications of quantification of training and monitoring of athlete adaptation to produce sports science. Some people, of course, went beyond that because then power output could be measured a few years later. You didn't have to estimate power output, you could measure it. And my colleague in Australia, Tammy Ebert, she went a step beyond, and using the same analysis process that we used with heart rate, she described the characteristics of the criterium, flat, and hilly stages of the Tour Down Under. And all of these are external values of the Tour Down Under. Then she produced figures similar to ours, but instead of using percentage of total race time at different heart rate values, they produce percentages of total race time at different ranks of power output. So you could describe the power output that you need to produce for different periods of time during the criterium, during the flat stages, during the hilly stages. But you could go beyond. And you could describe at what pedal cadence you need to produce those power outputs. And you could go one step further. And you can describe that even if you are in a hilly stage, you still need to produce about 40 supramaximal sprints. And you can even describe the duration of each one of those sprints. So you can actually cut down the performance requirements of professional cycling into little pieces so that you understand exactly what the athlete needs to prepare for. And you can even use racing and training as a laboratory to produce a power time curve for each individual athlete. And this was done in 2006, but very recently, my PhD student, Peter Leo, he produced an entire doctoral thesis based on the power analysis of under 23 cyclists and the process of going from being an under-23 cyclist to being a professional cyclist. And he produced 8 papers just by doing analysis of the power profile of individual athletes. Fourth point is monitoring training load to understand fatigue. Nowadays we have a lot of tools to monitor the training load. We have swim training assessment devices. We have heart rate monitors that work well underwater. We have heart rate monitors that can be put on the goggles at different points in your head to assess heart rate. Of course, we have a lot of cycling power measurement devices so that we don't need to estimate power output, but we can actually measure it instantaneously and relate that marker of external load, which is power output, or velocity, or incline, with one marker of internal load, which is the heart rate, the instantaneous heart rate of the athletes. And that has been used to describe cycling speed, power, and intensity distribution during triathlon. This is a paper by Jan Lemeur and colleagues in 2009 describing the power output bands and the time spent at different power outputs during a World Cup event. Here you can see during each lap the power output production in women and men. Nowadays, of course, you can do the same type of analysis with GPS-based time motion analysis. You can use these things to describe the running speed during a triathlon event. Here you see the running speed per lap, and here you see the running speed during flat, downhill, uphill, and the entire circuit, and the different sections of that circuit. So once you have the tool, you can actually cut down, as I said before, you can cut down the competition into little pieces to understand exactly what the demands of those competitions are, and therefore you can apply the principle of training specificity. More recently, there is this paper by Naroa Echeverria and colleagues, which is called Running Your Best Triathlon Race, in which they describe the mean pace in minutes and seconds per kilometer during the World Triathlon Series, lap by lap. And then in this table, you can see the relationship between the running time and the final time of the event. And by looking at this, you can realize that it is very important to maintain your speed in the final lap if you want to have a good result in your competition. It's logical, but you had to really analyze it and describe it properly. Nowadays, we also have these running power measurement devices, and we could even start prescribing, first describing and then prescribing our running training based on power output instead of based on running speed only. And of course, we also have training monitoring software like Athlete Monitoring, Training Peaks, FitStats, and all of these things. But we shouldn't get lost in that. This is a paper by my friend Shona Halson in which she looks at the variables that can be used to monitor training load and subsequent fatigue. And they are all described here. These are the variables of interest when we quantify training. Frequency, time, intensity, type, maximal effort, repeat efforts, training volume, perception of effort, perception of fatigue and recovery, illness, injury, biochemistry and hormone analysis, technique, body composition, sleep, psychology, sensations. That's all we need. That's all we want. And the good news is that if you look at the units or descriptors of each one of these variables, there is only biochemistry and hormone analysis that are difficult or expensive to achieve. Everything else can be done with a stopwatch, a piece of paper, and a pencil. Because for all these markers, there are validated questionnaires in the scientific literature. And I'll tell you more. This is a study that was published in 2018 looking at biomarkers of physiological responses to intensified training. And look at this. The majority of biomarkers demonstrate inconsistent findings due in part to large interindividual variability and variable responses between studies. So the only thing that you normally cannot measure is probably the least valuable of all those things. Something as simple as this graph here, the ROF, the Rating of Fatigue Scale, has taken years to validate, but the ROF scale shows good phase validity and high levels of convergent validity during ramp cycle to exhaustion. So acutely, you can describe the level of fatigue, but also chronically, resting, recovery, and daily living activities. The ROF scale was also found to discriminate between perceived exertion during recovery from exercise. So something as simple as this, in which the athlete tells you, I feel 5, or I feel 8, can provide you more valuable information than most biological markers. At the end of the day, what most coaches want is this. I think this is from Germany. When they asked German coaches what numbers they were most interested in, they said duration and type of training. So what did we do today? Did we run? Did we do weights? Did we swim? And for how long? And personal comments in the training diary. That was the most important information for the majority of coaches. From coaches' perspective, duration and kind of training, rating of perceived exertion, and personal remarks in the athlete's training diaries are considered to be essential information. The coaches favor a feasible system that collects large amounts of directly measurable and perceived data, and that is able to learn from previous events in order to present the most important information in a short individual overview. Don't give me a million numbers, just give me a summary of the most important numbers, something that I can use in my daily training. And you shouldn't be afraid of using subjective markers. This is a study by my colleague Anna So in Australia, looking at subjective self-reported and objective measures. And the main conclusions are that subjective measures respond to training-induced changes in athlete well-being. And that subjective measures are useful for athlete monitoring, and practitioners, that is you, that is me, might employ them with confidence. So don't be afraid of using subjective markers of how an athlete feels. We recommend that athletes report their subjective well-being on a regular basis alongside other athlete monitoring practices. So you can collect as much objective data as you want, but please also collect subjective data and put those in relationship. This is a more recent paper from 2022. While focusing on collecting and processing large amounts of data, analysts, scientists, and coaches might forget the outstanding potential of the human neurobiological system to dynamically and rapidly integrate massive amounts of personal and environmental information. So when you show that ROF scale to an athlete and you tell them, give me a number, how do you feel? All the information from training, all the information from the environment is integrated in his brain or her brain before she tells you 5 or before she tells you 7. And that is the value of subjective markers. Understanding and valuing subjective-based monitoring are crucial to enhance athletes' awareness and promote their self-consciousness, autonomy, and self-regulation of health and performance. So you need to emphasize this, and you need to encourage athletes to think about how they feel, to provide subjective markers of well-being. This is a study that was done over 4 years with professional cyclists. And they looked at training load measures in training, in road races, and during time trials. Some of those measures were objective, some were subjective. And what you see here is that all objective markers and all subjective markers, they correlate very well with each other. So basically, everything correlates with everything. In training, in mass start stages, and also during time trials. What does it mean? It means that training load based on RPE, heart rate, and power output are all reliable measurements for measuring training load in training, road racing, and time trials in professional cyclists. Any method of monitoring training load which is consistently applied and discussed between coach and athlete may be more or less equivalent in net value. So if you decide we are going to focus on power output, okay, we agree on that, let's work with that. It's good. But if you agree with your athletes to focus on perception of effort, it's also as good. What do I do when I go to altitude with elite athletes? Objectively, on a daily basis, I measure body mass, I measure resting heart rate, peripheral oxygen saturation, urinary specific gravity, sleep quality and sleep quantity, rating of fatigue every 4 to 5 days, and this is only optional. We might look at creatine kinase and urea. At the beginning and the middle and at the end of the camp, we do skin folds, and then we do blood lactate measures on coach's request, a la carte. And then we have started measuring hemoglobin mass and blood volume before and after the camp. This is an Olympic champion in swimming. So I provide the coaches, in this case I'm talking as a physiologist, not as a coach. I provide the coaches with a full report at the end of the camp, a full report about hemoglobin mass changes. That's at the end of the camp. But on a day-to-day basis, I look at the numbers and I tell the coach whether they can continue. Why? Because to me, as important as all those objective markers is what I see in training. So I am there in every training session to see how they behave, to see how they perform the prescribed training loads. And I am also there off training, because what happens off training provides you with a lot of practical information. So if you suggest, let's go out for a hike on Sunday morning that there is no swimming, do they say, yeah, let's go? Or do they say, no, I want to stay in my room, I want to talk to my boyfriend, blah, blah, blah. That's very useful information. And that information, you cannot collect it unless you are there on a day-to-day basis. So in this paper, what we did was summarize contemporary periodization of altitude training for elite endurance athletes. In table 5, we summarized the monitoring tools. These are the essential tools: training intensity, training volume, body mass, and athlete perception of stress, fatigue, and recovery. That's a must. And body mass here. And this is, iron profile. So that is essential. If you can only do 5 things when you go to altitude, do those 5 things. Then we have the optional, or the important things like hemoglobin mass, peripheral oxygen saturation, body composition, resting heart rate. That's important, but less important than what is essential. And then you have the optional things, such as urinary specific gravity, heart rate variability, urea, creatine kinase, and then hormonal markers. So you need to get your priorities right when you have to stratify the importance of the quantification and monitoring methods. Let's go with the concluding remarks so that we can have some time for questions. We've seen that we can measure everything, basically, nowadays. GPS, hormonal markers, watches. But that doesn't mean that we're going to lose our jobs as coaches. because there is no accurate quantitative means with which to describe the pattern, duration, and intensity of exercise required to produce specific physiological adaptations. So even if we can measure everything, there is no recipe for success. Individuals adapt differently to the same exercise stimulus. Despite years of research, no single physiological marker has been identified that can quantify the fitness and fatigue responses to exercise or predict performance with accuracy. So more emphasis needs to be directed towards the measurement of markers, plural, that reflect an individual's global capacity to respond or adapt to training, rather than looking for an absolute measure of the changes in physiological variables in responses to exercise. Quite often we look for that magic marker. That magic marker does not exist. The more information we can collect, the better we are going to assess what is going on. This is the sports wearable ecosystem. It's crazy. Smart clothing, hearables, smart watches and bands, GPS trackers. I don't even know what this, augmented reality and glasses and contact lenses, contactless biosensors, neuroscience, smart patches, smart footwear, sleep monitoring. It's absolutely crazy. But don't forget this editorial by Aaron Coutts, a physiologist from Australia. He says, although we must continue to encourage innovation, we must also maintain effective industry practices and protect the integrity of our discipline. We should avoid the temptation to overutilize the technology and all of its data before proof of concept and validity and reliability trials are completed. So don't use a toy just because you have it, unless you know that the results coming from that toy are valid and reliable. Without the ability to separate the signal and noise in the measures, we cannot make meaningful inferences on practice. What is signal and what is noise? The change I am seeing, is it because there has been a real change in the fitness of the athlete, or is it because there is variability in the measure? That's noise. We also should look for to establish parsimonious systems that are both cost-effective and time-effective. We might get a tool that works really well, but it costs $1 million. Oh, we can't use it. Or we might get a tool that works well, it is affordable, but you need 5 people to analyze it. You can't use it. Or you need 1 month to get the results. You can't use it. Because in 1 month, you don't have the same athlete. It's a different athlete already. It's the same person, but it's a different athlete. This scientific approach will allow us to take advantage of recent technological advancement and best position to have a positive impact on elite sporting performance. Will athletes engage in a monitoring training program? They will, but only if they receive sufficient feedback from the data entered. So if you ask athletes, do you receive sufficient feedback from your monitoring system? Look at this. A lot of them strongly disagree or are undecided. That's bad news. When there are meaningful changes in my scores, action is taken. Disagree, undecided. I respond honestly to the training monitoring question, and most of them do. But they need to see the outcome to get engaged. Training monitoring and feedback helps optimize my training and performances, and a lot of them agree or strongly agree with that. So if they see that there is some use to ask for that effort of quantifying everything and answering questions and registering and recording everything they do, they will do it. At the end of the day, for effective planning, we need to implement a sensitive and responsive learning system designed to enable the early detection of emerging threats and opportunities. That's the whole goal of quantifying on a day-to-day basis. We need information. Before we decide on training direction and we make decisions about training, we need information. And that information should have 3 sources. Number one, coach's opinion and perspectives. All of us are different. We have different backgrounds. We have different education. We believe in different things in training. That's good. That's valid. That's valid information, but it's not enough. We need to also integrate data from regular trends analysis. Oh, every year when we go to altitude, my athlete is terrible for 3 weeks and then she's on fire. That's a regular trend that repeats over time. That is information that we need to add in our cocktail before we decide what we're going to do. And then we need to use also data from daily objective and subjective monitoring before we decide what we are going to do today. Can we continue with the program as planned, or do we need to modify the program because of these numbers? That is important. This is another model from Aaron Coutts in Australia, which is very, very good. It talks about the fast-thinking practitioner. That's me at altitude in Sierra Nevada telling the coach every morning, based on today's numbers, you can go ahead with the plan. Or that's me telling the coach, that doesn't look good. Be careful with this particular athlete. And then that practitioner can feed data to the researcher who is in university, in their office, and they can analyze the data quality, and they can do statistics, and they can analyze everything slowly. And then they can provide evidence base to the daily systems. And here is an example of that. This is a paper that we published based on training camps that I had done over the years at altitude and at sea level with 4 or 5 Olympic champions, world record holders, world champions in cycling and swimming. But I had collected all of that to give recommendations to the coaches day to day. But at some point I thought, maybe all these numbers might provide additional information for the wider sports science community. And we put together all those numbers as researchers, slow thinkers, to produce this scientific paper. Comparing individual to group day-to-day change in monitored variables might prove effective to flag athletes potentially at risk of maladaptation, and this study provides further support for a multifaceted approach to monitoring elite athletes in training camp environments. So we can learn a lot from the day-to-day data, even in the long term. Or using data that I collected day-to-day to decide on training, I produced 4 papers, 4 case studies on Eneko Llanos. I coached Eneko for 10 years, and I collected data all the time to make decisions on training. But at some point, I looked back at those data, and I converted them to scientific publications. Most of the quantification of training and competition load information in endurance sports was summarized a few years ago in this paper. This paper was produced as a result of a conference that we had in Qatar. I was in charge of the endurance section, but in this particular special issue of the International Journal for Sports Physiology and Performance, there are papers about quantification in sprint sports, in power sports, in team sports, the use of GPS, etc., etc. So I think it's free access to the entire special issue. This is a book that has nothing to do with the sports. It is, Hugh Mackay is a social psychologist from Australia, and in this book there are some characters, and in this case it is a librarian who is talking. It's a character, a fictional character. And she says, the more high-tech we are becoming, the more there is real hunger for personal interaction. We all know that information, data, is a very different thing from wisdom and understanding. So I guess it was inevitable that as information became more plentiful and easier to access, there would be a corresponding demand for someone to help us make sense of it all. We are already well down the path of assuming that because information technology is so clever and attractive, fast, efficient, stimulating, we should embrace it in every way we can. The sheer brilliance of the new media technologies might also tempt us into thinking that they are actually better communicators than we are, leading us to blur the traditional distinction between communication and data transfer. Giving the coach numbers is not communicating. It's not information, it's just numbers. We need somebody to translate that into practical applications. And the only way to do that is by having FaceTime. That is, being there for athletes and coaches and making yourself available. In this case, I'm talking as a physiologist, not as a coach. If you're a coach, of course you are there, or you should be there. But as a physiologist, you also need to be there, because communication is key. And this is something that Gennady Turetsky, the former coach of Alex Popov, used to say. The art of coaching is the art of communication. This guy has nothing to do with sports science either. He's an astronomer and a mathematician. And he says, no theory of everything that the particle physicists supply us with is likely to shed any light upon the complex workings of the human brain or a turbulent waterfall. It is still possible to make important discoveries by observing the everyday things of life and asking the right questions. You don't always have to have satellites, accelerators, and overwhelming computer power. Sometimes complexity can be simple too. So even if you don't have any money, even if you don't have any technology, even if you don't have any support, simple things can help you quantify the training load and monitor your athletes' adaptations. Thank you.